it's a real privilege to be here this morning with all these beautiful people. The lesson this week is in Matthew chapter 14. We've said before that Matthew's goal in chronicling the teaching and the miracles of Jesus was to inform and convince his fellow Jews and future generations that Jesus was the Christ, the real Messiah. And today's lesson deals with one of the most significant events, perhaps a turning point in Jesus' earthly ministry. The feeding of the 5,000. And it's the only one of Jesus' many miracles recorded in all four of the Gospels. With this miracle, Jesus' popularity reached a pinnacle of his earthly ministry. Our focal passage is Matthew 14, verses 14 through 21. Now, this event is also recorded in Mark chapter 6, Luke chapter 9, and John chapter 6. The verses just before our focal passage give us some helpful context for the miracle that we're going to read about. But first I want to read Matthew 14, verses 14 through 21. You follow along with me. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place. It's already getting late, and the crowds, send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here to me," he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Now I want to read some earlier verses in chapter 14 that explain, that help us understand Jesus' mindset, maybe we'd call that. Now Herod had arrested John the Baptist, and bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. For John had been saying to him, "It's not lawful for you to have her." Herod wanted to kill John, but he was afraid of the people because they considered John a prophet. On Herod's birthday, the daughter of Herodias danced for them and pleased Herod so much that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. Prompted by her mother, Herodias, she said, "Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist." The king was distressed, but because of his oath and his dinner guests, he ordered that her request be granted, and had John beheaded in the prison. His head was brought in on a platter and given to the girl, who carried it to her mother. John's disciples came, took the body, and buried it, and then they went and told Jesus. That is what is referred to when Jesus heard what had happened. He needed some time with that. When Jesus got the news of his cousin John's death, he sought to find some solace somewhere away from those crowds of people that had been following him daily. that he had been dealing with daily. Mark tells us that it's also the time that the disciples were coming back, returning from that mission that Jesus had sent them out on, preaching and teaching the words that he had taught them, and healing the sick and the lame, and casting out demons like they'd seen him do. They returned, they came back to find Jesus teaching and healing too, followed by this large crowd of people seeking healing and listening to Jesus teach. Now, we know there must have been times when Jesus desired to withdraw from those crowds, to get away from those people. And he was under continuous stress and strain, and needed rest. And he wanted to get his disciples alone, probably to lead them in a little more better understanding of himself and who he was. And he needed time for prayer. And on this occasion, it was wise for him to go away. He didn't want a head-on collision with the authorities, not yet anyway. It was not the time for that. So, William Barclay suggests 3 obvious reasons why Jesus needed this time. What was the first one, you think? He needed some rest. He was a human man. He was tired.
And the crowds were just about to suffocate him.
Exactly. They were after him. I mean, he was a celebrity at this time, what we would call a celebrity. He needed to be out, and he needed to be out of the line of fire should Herod Antipas want to arrest him like he had arrested John. Matthew tells us earlier in this chapter that in the first couple of verses of chapter 14, that Herod had heard about Jesus and was afraid that Jesus was John the Baptist risen from the dead. And John had been all over the country, stirring up the people and causing unrest with the authorities. And he said, oh, here comes Jesus. He's going to do the same thing. Let's watch him. But apparently, I understand that first century Galilee was a really difficult place to get away from people. Sounds like North Fulton, Actually, everywhere I go, there's 1,000 people going that way,
Yeah.
But Josephus, the first century Jewish/Roman historian, tells us that this small country of Galilee, only 50 miles from north to south and 25 miles east to west, was heavily populated at this time, with more than 200 villages of 15,000 people or more. Now do the math, that's how many? 3 million people. That does sound sort of like North Fulton, doesn't it? Yeah. Now, from Capernaum, where they were, the best place to seek peace and quiet was the other side of the lake. So Jesus and his disciples embarked on one of their boats for the eastern shore, about a 4-mile row across the top of the lake. And so this crowd of people, drawn to Jesus' celebrity, had been watching with astonishment what Jesus said and did, and just, following his every move, probably. They could see that boat take off from the shore, and they could see the direction they were going. They knew where he was going. So what they did, they walked around the top of the lake, crossed the Jordan River at the little village of Bethsaida, and found Jesus in about a total 10-mile walk. Found Jesus on a hill just a few miles outside of Bethsaida with a big plain, meadow at the foot of the hill. I remember earlier, Marianne and I could walk the 3-mile trail over at the park in about an hour. Now it takes like all morning.
I knew where you were going. Cause he has to drag me.
So, 10 miles this crowd followed Jesus around the top of the lake. It took him, 3 or 4 hours to find, that's all the time he had alone with his disciples. And, John's gospel tells us that it was also, near the time of the Passover feast, and the crowd from Capernaum probably grew larger with pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem on their way around the lake. Walking along the roads, they said, well, where are you going? I'm following Jesus. He's I know, I've heard of him. He's the guy that's healing people. And, yeah, can I go with you? Come on, let's go. Let's find Jesus. And so Jesus is, all of a sudden there's this crowd of people approaching him across that plain like a herd of buffalo. And what does he do? Matthew records, at the sight of the crowd, Jesus' sympathy was kindled. Now, most of us would have reacted differently, wouldn't we? A little frustrated, maybe a little impatient. How'd they catch up with me? But what's the word that Matthew used?
Be a compassion on them.
Compassion, yeah. Now, this word, and I won't be silly and try to even pronounce the Greek word that Matthew used, but this word is used 8 times in the gospel to describe Jesus' feelings. It's more than having sympathy. Jesus' compassion led to action. He healed their sick, Matthew says. Now Luke used the same word to describe the Good Samaritan's concern for the injured man on the Jericho road. It shares the same root word as the word for guts or bowels, innards. Now, the Greeks believed that the seat of our emotions was the bowels or the entrails. Did you know that? Now, we say heart, right? But all of us have had that pit of the stomach feeling as an emotional reaction to something that's happened to us in our lives. I mean, maybe those old Greeks were right,
That's where it was.
You've had that feeling. Romans 5:8 says, Christ-like love always demonstrates itself in action. Jesus healed their sick and spoke to the crowd of the kingdom of God, Luke says in his account in chapter 9. The miracle of the feeding of the multitude took place as evening approached, verse 15. The crowd had been with Jesus all day and were naturally hungry. John tells us that Jesus asked Philip, one of the disciples, who grew up, by the way, in Bethsaida and knew the territory, knew the area, where can we buy enough food for all these people? And Jesus knew what he was going to do, but he was sort of testing Philip, I think. Now, Philip says, John tells us, that, Master, it would take over a half year's wages to feed all these people. We can't, there's no way. Now, apparently the disciples themselves had already recognized this problem, and in their minds, the only course of action was to send this crowd away, let them fend for themselves. Find a McDonald's somewhere, get your own food. And the disciples have also covered their bases with Jesus when he replied, they don't need to go away. You feed them. The disciples apparently had canvassed the audience, and he said, all we came up with was this boy's lunch, He's got 5 pieces of barley pita bread and 2 sardines. Said, we don't think this is going to do it, Master. But Jesus knew, I'll say this again, Jesus knew what he was going to do, didn't he? He says, okay, boys, bring what you got. Bring it over here to me. And He told the disciples to have everybody sit down on the grass in groups of 50. Mark and Luke say in groups of 50 and 100, which is similar to how Moses organized the people in the wilderness when they were out harvesting the manna in the desert. They went in groups of 50 and 100. Sit down or sit is the word for recline at a banquet table. You know how they didn't sit in chairs and tables, they reclined at a low table. Sit at a banquet table. And sit on the green grass, Mark says, a little detail that you don't get unless this is like an eyewitness account that Mark probably got from his mentor, Simon Peter. So the grass was green, as a matter of fact, is significant also. Only in the springtime was the grass green in this region of the country, which coordinates with other accounts that says this was the time of Passover. So we have the time and the people. Now note the grouping of this, the way Jesus grouped the people had another advantage. And a numbers guy like Matthew could easily count the crowd, 50, 150, 250, he could count the crowd easy. Matthew and all the other gospels too report 5,000 men fed that day. Matthew adds that not counting 5,000, not counting the women and children. Now do a little math with me. You ready? If half the men, half the 5,000 men, had their wife and one child with them, what was the total count of the crowd? That would be 2,500 plus 3 times 2,500 is equal to 10,000. All of a sudden, the crowd is doubled. 10,000 people. 10,000 people.
So it wasn't 5,000.
No. Yeah. If half the 5,000 men had their wife and 2 children with them, which would be more like the normal family unit in Palestine, that would be 2,500 plus 4 times 2,500 would be 12,500. Yeah, 12,500 people. All of a sudden, wow.
Who said that?
Walter probably.
Numbers guy
Oh,
over
the
here.
numbers guy.
I didn't say it.
You sure
If I did, I was asleep.
Now, one more time.
I was still-
One more time.
Yeah, I was still counting.
If 75% of the men had their wife and 2 children with them, 75% of them, that would be divided by 4 plus 4 times. You got your calculator with you, Dwayne? Okay. 16,250. Now that's why scholars today estimate this crowd as upward of 20,000 people, not 5. And is that not amazing? Jesus took the loaves and the fishes and blessed them, acting as the father of the family at the table. And the grace he used may have been the one used in every Jewish home. Blessed art thou, Lord our God, who causest to come forth bread from the earth. Reminiscent of the Passover Seder, Jesus took the bread, broke it, blessed it, gave the bread and the fish to the disciples to give to the crowd. Now don't you know that many of the Jews in this multitude of people saw the significance of that progression. Many of them were on their way to Jerusalem already to celebrate the Passover Seder themselves. So they knew sort of, wow, that looks familiar. So what happened? They distributed the food. What happened?
Where did they get all the baskets?
Well, I'm told there is an answer to that. Every Jew who was traveling carried a basket with his extra robe and and supposedly sometimes a little bit of food,
Okay,
and,
I've always wondered that.
yeah, and it has a name, and I forget what the name of that basket is, but it was like a symbol. If somebody drew a caricature of a Jew on the road, he had a basket on his back, kind of, that kind of thing.
Good deal.
My mind always goes through, what did they have? How many pieces of bread? 5?
5 loaves.
Okay, so a loaf of bread.
Yeah.
So you hand it.
This is not Wonder Bread,
I'm
though.
sorry.
No,
No, I'm just saying, my mind goes, how did this happen? Did it go boom? Or somebody walks up and breaks off a piece, and when he walks to the next guy, he still has a loaf of bread in his hand. You know, he slides it up.
How did
breaks
this
it
happen?
up. And, how did they get these 3 or 4 fish?
Yeah.
And
Gee-
I'm trying to think of how it happened.
The miracle is that a little bit in the hands of Jesus becomes much, and we don't, we don't even know how that happened. The people ate and were filled. In the hands of Jesus, a little is a lot. The word for filled is the word for a contented cow. Did you know? When used of people, it meant fed to repletion, which kind of reminded me of pushing away from the table, at Grandma's Thanksgiving. Fed to repletion. Anyway, when everybody had eaten their fill, Jesus told the disciples to gather up the fragments left. At Jewish feasts, it was a regular practice to leave something for the servants. They called it the payah. And how many baskets were taken up?
12.
12. Coincidence, huh? How many disciples are there? Matthew kind of ends his narrative right there, very abruptly. Would have been nice if he'd just given us a little more information about the aftermath of what was one of Jesus' most significant miracles. Now, what do you think those disciples were feeling at the end of this event? If you had been there, what would you have been thinking about this? Don't you think those disciples were like over the top? If they had ever had any doubts about the power of Jesus, they were all in now, right? They each carried a basket of proof, as a matter of fact, a basket full of proof. They were probably experiencing what we call a spiritual high. They may have second-guessed Jesus when he challenged them for them to feed the people. But they would never second-guess him again, would they? Or would they?
It would.
And to say the people who had been fed were excited about this miracle, probably a really gross understatement. I would think. Jesus, now John is the writer who tells us the reason Jesus closed with prayer and dismissed the crowd, instructing the disciples to meet him on the other side of the lake. John chapter 6, verse 15 reads, Jesus, knowing they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. Jesus, whose kingdom is not of this world, John tells us in his book in chapter 18, dismisses the multitude of people to be by himself, to be alone with his heavenly Father. The end. You'll just have to come tune in next week.
Now listen, I'll pick
Same
you right
station,
up. Right there.
same time,
Okay.
same station.
Pick up right there.
Wallace
All
is going to take us into the exciting events that happen in the next chapter of Matthew's book. But in the few minutes that I have left, let's talk about some of the people. Let's look at some of the people involved in this momentous event. Really, I thought about Andrew. Andrew is the disciple who was the one who brought the boy to Jesus. William Barclay writes that no one ever knows what will come out of bringing someone to Jesus. As parents and grandparents, I'm thinking about friends and teachers and neighbors. That's what disciples of Jesus do. By how we live, by what we do and say, we present people to Jesus. Barclay goes on, no one knows what that child or neighbor may someday do for Christ. When you bring somebody, show Jesus to somebody. Then there's that boy. He didn't have much, did he? What he had, Jesus found the materials for a miracle. Yeah. Jesus needs what we can bring him. It may not be much, but he needs it. He'll take ideas, time, energy, talent, skills, a sense of humor, money, anything that we have to offer, and use it to do a miracle, to do the miraculous. Now, what about those disciples? They're the ones that passed out the food that Jesus had multiplied. Somebody said, as disciples, we are distributors, not manufacturers. God has chosen to work this way, hasn't he? He needs somebody, he needs people through whom he can act and speak. Now, what about the crowd, this crowd of thousands, witnessing and being a part of a miraculous feeding, a stadium full of people, and listening to Jesus teach about what was he teaching? A new way of living, a new way of life. Now, a part of that crowd, hopefully a minor percentage of that crowd, saw nothing but a boiling pot of political power in Jesus. They're the ones who were ready and willing to turn this whole event into a mob riot and start a conflict with the oppressive government and with the Roman occupiers. Now I say hopefully a minority, because I'm hoping that most of the people who had been listening to and fed by Jesus got up from that grass with a sense of a new relationship with God and the people around them, from what they had heard and seen from Jesus. They may not have identified him as the Messiah quite yet, but they were coming to realize that the message and the actions of Jesus were directly from God. Now, you may do this too. I'm wondering if I'd been a part of that crowd. You ever thought about that? Would I have been skeptical? Would I have misunderstood and believed the political hype? Or would I be a part of the crowd that recognized Jesus for who he is? Maybe and gone back home with a new perspective on how to live and my relationship to God. It was, maybe you do that too. Put yourself as a part of the story. It was a day for decisions to be made. It was a big deal. And I'm looking forward to Wallace next week. Let's have a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for your presence. Thank you for your healing, sustaining hand. Make us sensitive to your working in our lives. We bring what we can, and Lord, praise you for the way you bless and feed our spirit every day. Be with us as we continue to worship. In Jesus' name, amen.